First, I just want to say what an honor it is to be at the 92nd Street Y, which has made such extraordinary contributions to our political, our cultural, and our philosophical conversations. It's institutions like this, although there's really no institution quite like this, that make our country great. Not great again, just plain great. And it's a real joy to be with Congressman Joe Kennedy. I think of him as my second congressman because he represents my hometown of Fall River, Massachusetts. He actually represents the house I grew up in. So we got Fall River folks. There you go. That means we might even have we share the most unpopular position in American public life. We are both New England Patriots fans. So I'm sorry to throw you in. Hey, we're doing all right tonight. So I'm just going to go right into it with you and ask the question, everybody else is running for president. Why the heck aren't you?
You found one, right? You found one who's not. EJ, first off, thank you for being here. To everybody out there who I actually can't see, but I hope there's people out there, thank you for coming. Really looking forward to the conversation, and I will echo what EJ said about this incredible institution. This is one of the invitations that I received that I just could not believe I received it, so I'm really thrilled and excited for this evening, so thank you for having me. There's plenty of other people running. I got a 3-year-old, a 1-year-old, and I'm in dire need of sleep and coffee, and that seems like a tight enough agenda at the moment.
You could drink coffee as a candidate. I mean,
Not enough, EJ, not enough.
Well, while we're on the subject, you might still decide to get in at some point since everybody else does. You've endorsed Elizabeth Warren, and you could talk about that if you like, but I'd like to ask sort of the larger question about the year and a half ahead, which is a two-part question. What do Democrats need to do to win? And this is the kind of question Democrats are always asked. What do you think Democrats might do to blow this election? What are you most hopeful for, and what are you most concerned about?
What I'm most concerned about is quick. What I'm most concerned about is that our party decides very clearly what we are against and not what we're for. And if you spend all your time trying to beat Donald Trump and not earn the respect, the support, earn back the credibility of the American public, then we lose. And I firmly believe, look, the divisions that we are seeing across our country at the moment, Donald Trump is both symptom and cause. He is clearly not trying to heal those divisions. I think he is stoking them and cracking those fissures even further. But he was a symptom of some of those cracks that got him elected in the first place. He wasn't the reason that those foundations started and those institutions started to crack to begin with. And so if we just focus on him, we're going to lose. You got to also articulate what we're for, not just who we're against. And to that, I think there's a lot of big issues out there that our country needs to address, from healthcare to climate change to immigration to taxes and economy. EJ, the single biggest one that I'm not sure anybody has quite put their finger on right yet, myself included, is the fact that what unites those issues and so many others is an economy that is structured so that those that are doing well and are plugged into it can succeed greatly, but that overlooks, takes for granted, shuts out millions of others, and that they don't get, not only are they not included in it, not only can they not access it, but their contribution is then not considered or incorporated, and that they are not empowered. And that is, I think, at a core of the division that we are seeing. And if we don't find a way to address that, and I think that is long and hard and deep and complex, but if we can't speak to that and touch that and address that, you fall victim to a divide and conquer strategy that Donald Trump executed so well in his first election. That might get him a second.
I want us to get to this series of speeches you've given on moral capitalism, but looking at the Democrats just for one more moment, I look at this and say all these fights between, if you will, left and center left, or moderate and more progressive, what is the potential for those fights to get the party off track? I think, for example, of the argument on health care and whether you are for or against a version of single payer when the truth is everybody is for covering everybody. And how could the conversation sort of become more divisive than it has to be, or is this just people fighting over principle and that's okay?
So, great. So I think...
No, you're going to solve the dilemma right here. You know,
buckle up, folks. Here we go. So, look, I think one is you can't take the bait. Look, if you aspire to be a Big Tent party, which we are, I think Democrats always were, we are now, particularly back in the majority, that spans, we have a number of new voices that are proud progressives, which is great. You've got a number of moderates as well that helped win back much of the heartland where we didn't have a loud voice before, and that's also great. And we have to be a party that actually allows for all of those voices to be at the table and for that discussion. And we're not going to solve every problem in these 2 years. And by the way, if you want differences of opinion, you want to celebrate those differences of opinion. The part that I think the answer to it is actually what you touched on. There are real differences and trade-offs between various healthcare plans out there, from lowering the age of Medicare to a Medicaid buy-in, to a public option, to a single-payer system, as many of these are currently being contemplated and rolled out. All of them are different, and those trade-offs are significant. I'm not trying to totally roll over those or gloss over those. But the fundamental value there is that everybody in this country deserves to have a healthcare system where you get the care that you need when you need it at a price that you can afford, and that the federal government has a responsibility to ensure that every single person can access it, and to facilitate that value that in the richest, most powerful nation in the world, healthcare is not a luxury only for those who have. And Republicans' response to this is actually pretty clear. Success is taking away healthcare from 30 million people. And so if you look at that, yes, there's a difference between a public option and a single-payer system, yes. The underlying value there is everyone gets healthcare. And the underlying value that Donald Trump and the Republican Party stands for at the moment on healthcare is that is not only not part of the responsibility of the federal government, but you are literally on your own. And when it comes to that value for me, look, our healthcare system, like many things in my job, I'm stealing this from my wife, who is far more articulate at this than I am, who said, look, she works in healthcare policy, and she said, our healthcare system is about the way we treat those when you are most in need, understanding that any single one of us can be, and all of us will be, and what kind of system you would want there for your loved one, your child, your spouse, your parent, and making sure we make that commitment for everybody. That's what I think the system that we all deserve, that's what America deserves. And I think the way you get there is ensuring that the government has a seat at that table to make that happen, because we've seen that a private market can't do it on its own. We can have that debate about the various options, but framed that way versus what Republicans stand for, as currently defined when it comes to healthcare, there is a big difference. And let's debate that difference, because that's essentially the core of what this debate is about.
And thank you for that. I was waiting for that. The moral capitalism. I sort of want to ask you about that from two angles. If I work for the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which they're probably happy I'm not, I would ask, why does capitalism need the moral adjective in front of it? Isn't capitalism moral? Or I could go the other way, why moral capitalism, why not socialism? What is it about this term that grabbed you and maybe put some meat on the bones about what it means for you?
So I'll give it my best shot, and that's going to start with the caveat of I'm not 100% certain I've got this all right, so welcome the feedback as it comes in. Look, as I bounced around the country over the course of the past election cycle, and I visited a whole bunch of states from California to Texas to Florida to West Virginia to Indiana to Michigan to Pennsylvania, you end up in these circumstances where you get in front of a crowd and you actually got to figure out what to say, and you end up talking to people, and hopefully you do a little bit of listening too. And look, you talk to people from all different walks of life, different ages, different backgrounds, different jobs, but a level of economic anxiety that actually was consistent throughout a lot of those places. And the fact is that you hear stories of folks that say, look, I'm working hard and playing by the rules and I ain't getting ahead anymore. And that was kind of the democratic formulation of what an economy should be. You work hard, play by the rules, you get ahead. The response to that has been largely characterized, although I don't think this is actually true, but largely characterized by, or mischaracterized by critics of the left's response of saying, it's just tax the wealthy and that'll solve all the problems. And the answer to that, from my perspective, is yeah, we're going to need to increase revenue into our system to make some of the investments that we need, but that's actually not sufficient enough, because this is not just a question of resources, this is a question of empowerment. We have seen over the course of the past several decades an erosion not just of the leverage that a worker, that an employee brings to the table, but of an ability of an individual, of a family, to be able to feel empowered that they can earn enough and ensure a better tomorrow than today for their kids. And that at its core, I think, is what a system that we, in the biggest, strongest country in the world, should be able to provide for our people, is saying, it's okay to say success is an achievement, that people are going to have to work for it, but if you do, tomorrow is in fact going to be better than today. And the fact is that an American capitalist system has created more wealth and more prosperity than any other system in human history, and we've brought more people out of poverty over the course of the past couple of decades around the world than any other system in human history, without doubt. It's just that a lot of that has been now done on the backs of an American middle class that are feeling like they're the ones left holding the bag. And so how do we then make some of these changes to actually put those American families at the center of it? And I think that starts by asking questions like, if you're going to be a fast food worker, why, if you sign up at the McDonald's down the street, in the fine print of that employment contract is a no poach clause or a non-compete, so you can't go work at a Burger King if you get a better wage by 50 cents an hour, that you are now barred from doing so? Why is it that credit card companies can have forum selection clauses or forced arbitration clauses or limit class actions, as a ruling from the recent ruling from the Supreme Court, such that if I get gypped by $100 or something in a credit card bill, maybe I can find a way around it or through it. It's not going to be devastating to me, but for folks lower on an income ladder, that's actually a big deal, and they're not going to get a lawyer to try their case. They can't find any recourse, and if you can't band together to get a class action lawsuit together, there is no recourse. Why is it that when you talk about the underlying structures of our society, when you talk about the new tax code that just came back, you incentivize over $1 trillion in stock buybacks, but not a dime ends up going to workers? Why is it that it's particularly at a time when 50% of Americans, over half, don't own a single stock? And worse for women, worse for African Americans, worse for Latinos. But you've got this enormous aggregation of wealth that is now being brought back into American companies that go to equity holders and executives and not at all to employees. And if you start asking those questions, I don't have a great answer for why that, in fact, makes those families and individual parents that are trying to do everything they can, as every parent does, to provide for a better tomorrow for your kids. I don't have a good answer for them as to why those policies help them or how those policies help them do that. And that's where I think the moral part of this comes in, of saying, look, I don't know of a better system out there, but I do know that this has gotten off kilter, and to a point where when the Forbes 400 billionaires off their list, the top billionaires off their list, have more wealth than every single African American household in this country and a quarter of Latino households in this country combined, then that's a challenge. When in Boston, the average net worth for a white family is roughly $250,000, $247,000. You know what the average net worth for an African American household in Boston is?
Well, I read the speech, so I know the answer.
$8.
I was stunned when I saw that. Yeah.
Folks, we can do better than that, right? It just comes down to that. We can do better than that.
During the last campaign, it was often the case that the people you were talking about include African Americans, Latinos, but also include white working class people. And in this last campaign, in a lot of districts, I think of Connor Lamb as an example in Pennsylvania, the only people that they wanted to come in were you or Joe Biden. And the question is, what happened to Democrats? Why?
You need more people named Joe. That's the first part.
All right, that's it. Never mind. I'll stop there. Yeah, just
Going that
plain
way.
Joe.
Go with Joe.
What
Go
happened?
back to the Sopranos line of Boston and Scranton without Scranton is Boston without the clams, right? It's like you go back to
Or the Red Sox.
right. There you go.
They have the Yankees farm team, but anyway.
So look, I think I'm a big admirer of the vice president, and I think what Mr. Biden, Vice President Biden, one of his great qualities that he never lost was a sense that in his heart, his focus, the cause of his time in office was making sure that the middle class had a seat at the table. And I am really honored, but some of my colleagues, Connor Lamb and others, invited me into places like that race outside of Pittsburgh or in West Virginia and in Indiana, and let's be clear, recognize that the reason for that is not necessarily what I have done in office, but a vestige of some of my familial predecessors in office and their work on this. But I think comes back to a fundamental piece that really Democrats, I think goes to our core. It's that everybody counts. And that you don't write anybody off. And that you end up in these discussions today at a political level of saying, hey, how do you get to 270 electoral votes? How do you get to 51%? How do you slice and dice the electorate and count here and count there? And you say, look, I get why you would do that, but why are we also writing anybody off? Why are we sitting there saying, look, we are going to make an electoral strategy out of winning major metropolitan centers across this country and just say, we'll write off rural America? Why? Why does those voices not count too? Why do we want to cede the fact that, why would we stand if you believe that government has an essential role to play to actually make a contribution in people's lives? Why are we going to say, yeah, but in rural America, you don't count. We're not going to hear you because we don't think that we can actually address those concerns appropriately. And if we get to that point, shame on us. So show up. Listen, take the heat. Understand that people are going to be frustrated. And if nobody showed up in my hometown for years either, and then showed up and said, hey, I want you to make a contribution or go knock on a door or throw me a vote, what are you smoking? How could you possibly think that if no one shows up here for years and the perception that I have is that you're taking me for granted or can't relate to the everyday challenge that I have, why would I possibly think that you're going to represent my interest in Washington, D.C. or anywhere else for that matter? Show up. Listen. Be humble enough to take the criticism, deserved or not. But there's no short answer to this. I apologize for rambling a little bit. The best story I have for you from my perspective on this, EJ, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and there's an awful lot about the Peace Corps that I actually think is really similar to my life in elective office. So I got dropped down in the middle of the Dominican Republic, never been there, spoke some Spanish when I got there. And I was like, what most Peace Corps volunteers, a tree-hugging do-gooder that was going to change the world one little family and village at a time. Like, give me 2 years and we'll do it. It's a little harder than that, turns out. But I remember 2 years later, when I was leaving, their community was throwing me a goodbye party, and one of the guys that I always knew was a little skeptical of me pulled me aside and said, it took us a year to actually trust you. And I was like, pal, what are you, nuts? Like, I left my family, I left my home, I came down here, I got every sickness known to man and plenty of others that weren't. I poured my heart out for you for 2 years. How did you not trust me? And he went, we've been taken advantage of by anybody in a position of power has always taken advantage of us. And people come in and say they're going to do X, Y, and Z, and they always take whatever they want for their own benefit. And I was like, yeah, but U.S. law doesn't allow me to. And he was like, who cares? Right? But it means that it took me a year of living in a community, learning their language, doing everything I possibly could to ingratiate myself to them, for them to trust me, how are you going to do that at a diner stop in 20 minutes? You got to earn this back. And that is a team effort. No one person can do it, but it means that you get candidates and you get people and you get folks that are just going to start showing up and saying the most basic question. What do you need? How can I help? What can I contribute? We'll be fine.
You talked about how you were called into some of these places in part because of your name and the tradition you stood for. What's it?
I don't think that was all just because of me. I mean,
What is that like to carry that around? It's obviously a great advantage in a bunch of ways, and it's a burden in other ways. And how do you think about that? And I guess I'll ask the second question I wanted to ask anyway together, which is why did you go into public life? What made you decide to do this? Because in some ways it would seem obvious. His name is Kennedy. He's on the ballot in Massachusetts. I used to say in Fall River, where I grew up, the turnout slogan was "Vote for the Kennedy of your choice, but vote." You know, and
they're bringing that one back, EJ. Bringing that one back.
you know, so it was obvious, and yet it wasn't obvious because there's a lot of pain in this. There's a lot of pain in the history, and everybody will come along and say, "Well, it's because you have this name." I mean, we've heard that in campaigns going back to 1962.
Yeah.
So what made you do this?
So a couple of things. I guess start with the second question, then you can remind me what the first one was if I lose it. Government matters, and whether we like it or not. And sometimes we like it, and sometimes we really don't, but it matters. I wouldn't have run for office had I not had that experience in the Peace Corps. I spent 2 years living with a group of Dominican, predominantly young men, but Dominican families, that were no less talented than I was, certainly no less intelligent than I was, certainly no less gifted than I was. But their horizons and futures were limited because there was not a structure set up in their country that was going to allow them to take advantage of their talent, their potential, and their hard work. And when you spend 2 years living in a community like that with intermittent electricity and intermittent running water and folks that would make a couple bucks a day, I think their per capita income when I was there was roughly around $2,000 or $3,000 a year, who would without hesitation take half of their plate and slide their food onto mine, who cared for me when I was sick and looked out for me every day I was there. It becomes awfully hard to sit there and say that's right. It becomes awfully hard to sit there and say that structure is justified. And to come back to the United States and know that those structures are not, that there's parts of our society here that are not all that dissimilar from the ones that I saw there, that our country is unique, but that it's not without challenges. And that, yes, the private sector has an awful lot of leverage to bring to that and to address some of those challenges without question, but that ultimately the structures of society is government's role and government's function. And where the private sector fails, government has to come in and address it and compel change. And so it was through that experience, and then out of law school, a series of experiences I had, more economic development work overseas, and then a lot of legal aid work that I did when I was in law school, predominantly in a foreclosure crisis, and then prosecutor's office, and a lot of cases that I worked with were on, it was right in the midst of a prescription opioid epidemic. And a lot of the cases that I had were kids that were not that much, no real age difference from what I was at that time, in my late 20s probably. Kids that were breaking into 4 or 5 homes over the course of a weekend, 15 cars in a night. And I remember some of these cases that break into 15 cars. Everybody had a GPS at that point. They didn't have them in their smartphones yet. And the cops would go sit on the local pawn shop, and some kid would come in with a backpack and drop off all these GPSs. The cops would seize the backpack and just touch the home button, and case is solved. And by the way, that kid's now charged with 15 felonies. And look, you're breaking into homes. That is a serious crime. But they're also sick. And the DA I was working with said, look, your job is not actually to lock somebody up for as long as you can. Your job is to make sure that person never commits another crime. And if there's some underlying issue there, address the underlying issue as best you can. And for a lot of those folks, it was addiction. We had some tools, but you didn't have a ton. And that's policy that should be further upstream. And that is essentially, at its core, what we should be doing in elective office, federal, state, local level, all of it combined. And it was another instance for me of just saying, look, the policy here, or lack thereof, has real visceral impacts for families that are now, parents that are now watching their kids go to jail. last one I'll end on in this one, EJ. I remember, I told this story all the time over the course of my first campaign, and I remember it pretty darn clearly. It was a Friday, late morning. We'd finished the arrest from that day, and a late arrest came in. And our office was down the street, down the hill, so they sent the new prosecutor up to arraign this gentleman. And I'm walking into the courthouse, and this guy, this dad, in a leather jacket steps forward and says, "Hey, I want to talk to you about my son. He just got arrested." And I went, "Yeah, but I'm the prosecutor. The defense attorney's down the hallway." And he said, "No, I want to talk to you because I want you to hold my son without bail." That was a new one. And he told me that his son had just returned from fighting overseas, and he'd gotten addicted to OxyContin, and that he had stolen and sold almost every piece of jewelry that the family had. Mom came by at this point, and that he wasn't sure what his son would do if he were released. They got in a bed for him at a treatment facility on Monday, but they needed to make sure he would get there, and the only thing that family could think of was to get him arrested and have him spend the weekend in jail. And so this case gets called. I call a supervisor because I go, "Look, I don't know what you want me to do with this." Supervisor comes over. And it's a Vietnam vet that ends up was the judge. And circumstances get explained. This young vet stands up, and he turns to the judge, and he apologizes. And he says, he apologized to his family, and he said, "Look, I don't know what I will do if I get released from here today." And the judge held him without bail, and I never saw the guy again. Presumably he was released on Monday to a treatment facility. That is the way we ended up treating somebody that returned from fighting overseas. That is the burden we put on a family. That is the burden we put on that young man. That is the burden we put on the criminal justice system to now try to respond to the fact that we have a woefully inadequate mental health system, and we have criminalized mental illness and disease. And that is a core responsibility of government and the federal government. And that's one of the reasons why that's one of my areas of focus in Congress.
Could I ask why you decided to become a prosecutor? I've been thinking about this because you're looking at this campaign, and what being a prosecutor used to be a great job to run for office from, and now there are all kinds of questions being asked of prosecutors because of the need for criminal justice reform. What moved you to want to do that early out of law school?
So I think two things there. And I got that question even when I was in law school of some folks that would say, "Oh my God, that's a terrible thing to go do. Why wouldn't you become a defense attorney?" And without question, we need good defense attorneys, and you need a robust and talented public defender system. Massachusetts actually has a very good one. And they're great folks that do dedicated work. The first step in the criminal justice system is the prosecutors. The first move is the prosecutors. It's charging authority. It's what am I going to charge you with? The authority to break down a case, to plea a case out. The authority to say, "Hey, how am I going to cut a deal?" The ability to say, "Hey, there's a group of folks together, you're the real bad guy, you're the one that's along for the ride, you're in the wrong place, wrong time." A defense attorney, all of them need robust defense. It's the prosecutor's opportunity, I would argue responsibility, to actually figure out an obligation, to figure out how to initiate that first step to do justice. And I think you can make a pretty strong argument that, not to disparage other prosecutors out there, I think a whole lot of them do really good work, but if you had more folks that actually if our system had more folks that approach the job that way, you're going to get a sea change in our criminal justice system, rather than a system where we say, "Hey, you know what, let's charge the maximum charge we can get because we can deal with it later, and let's use this as leverage to try to extract the maximum penalty because that's what we can do." If the goal is to make sure that individual actually never commits another crime and that justice is served, that's not always what you can do. And I'll finish by saying, look, there are also, one of the challenges in working that system, there are bad people that do really bad things, and you get to see some of that. And those folks aren't going to get a whole lot of sympathy from me, because you do see the other side of that, and that can get visceral too. But the prosecutor has an essential role to play in this if we're actually going to get to a system that I think is at least where I believe we should go. You had another question in there that I forgot.
No, I think because of the campaign, the use against candidates in a campaign.
And you said, why did I actually run for Congress to begin with? So you heard some of that answer. The part that I think most people don't know, So obviously I grew up around people that were in office. You probably did know that. So look, this
It's a
wasn't...
very intelligent audience.
There you go, yes. So it wasn't foreign to me, right? You meet your dad's coworkers just like most of you ever did, or your other family members' coworkers, and they were like the guy passing the sandwich at lunch, or somebody that when you were playing touch football out back, where they could catch a pass when you were 10, or whether they didn't, and that was like you're on my team or the other team, and that was kind of the way you went about it, right? But they were just people. They happen to be members of Congress, but when you were 10, who cares? They're your dad's friends. But I was around it, so it didn't seem as foreign to me. The piece that I think people probably don't know is the person that pushed me hardest not to run was my dad. And he said, when it kind of came down to decision time, I wasn't planning on running for Congress at the moment that Congressman Frank announced his retirement. I had just shifted jobs. I was about to try to get engaged. She said yes, thank God. But there was a bunch of other things on the agenda. Running for office was not one of them. But he pulled me aside and said, listen, do you want to do this? And I went, yeah, I think so. And he's like, well, that's not good enough. If you're going to do this, you better know that this is what you want to do, because campaigns are like nothing else you will go through. It is grueling, and it is 7 days a week. It is 24 hours a day. You are never, the biggest change for me that I didn't expect, you are never alone, ever. And in a tight one, the press's job is to vet you, and so they're going to poke at to find your greatest weakness and then see how you respond to it. And if your heart is not in this, you're not going to withstand that scrutiny, just because you're not going to want to, because who wants to go to work 30 days in a row in the midst of rain, sleet, snow, miss all sorts of other things that family and friends are doing if your heart is not in this? And the public will tell, because they can sniff it out. And then it's going to get miserable and you will lose. And so do not do this unless you really, really want to do this, and then you want that job. And once you get that job, you're willing to commit yourself and your family to that job. Best advice I got.
We've got a whole series of issues facing the country now that we haven't even touched, and I just want to touch on a few of them.
Speed round.
And we're also looking forward to the questions from the audience. Gun control. And I want to, again, link two things. One is gun control, and the other is this rise of what you might call right-wing terrorism. I'm speaking of Christopher Paul Hassan and the news that came out just, I guess, yesterday or the day before. What do we do about this as a country? We've got a bill coming up before Congress next week, it looks like. Can we ever make any progress on this? And what are your fears about this? Again, I've called it right-wing terrorism. I don't know what else to call it. It's very scary stuff, and you wonder, where does this come from? How new is this? How do we deal with it?
So, elections matter, and the House Judiciary Committee passed for the first time in over a decade a bill to try to limit gun violence in this country last week, and we will vote on it on the House floor, or scheduled to, next week. That's a big deal. And I think what do is you continue to make the case. We continue to rely not just on political leaders here, but sadly and tragically, but with an incredible amount of inspiration, high school students that refused to accept the status quo as an answer and said, if adults aren't going to do your jobs to protect your kids when you go off to school, then we will make sure we protect our own. And that have done so in an incredible way. And that aren't accepting no for an answer. Day after day after day, I've gotten to know a couple of the families from Parkland and the kids, and a couple who have come by Boston a number of times, Manuel and Patricia Oliver, who lost their son, Joaquin, a year ago in Parkland, February 14th. And when they did one of the marches, 50 miles, his dad, Manuel, walked him in Joaquin's shoes, literally. And you hear him and another dad that lost his daughter, Fred Gutenberg, who said the same thing to me, which was haunting. Which is just because each one of them said it differently. Manny said my son, and Fred said my daughter. Just because they're gone doesn't mean I stop being their dad. And I can't imagine, who can, what that is. But to know that they have turned this moment of extraordinary personal loss and tragedy into something that they will not stop. And if they can do this after that, then...
And this threat from the right, this armed right, you see it as this doesn't seem like a one-off, and the FBI seems to be saying they're worried about other potential incidents like this. What's your sense from where you sit?
So I want to be a bit careful here. I think, obviously, the details emerging from I think it was Maryland all along this are extremely troubling is an understatement, right? It's scary, without question. We also had, and again, without getting into too far down this, we had a colleague of mine, a Republican colleague of mine, that almost died on a baseball field over a year ago. And so, do I think the rhetoric needs to get toned down about people being, one American being somebody else's enemy? Yeah, I do. Do I think that there's access to weapons that can do extraordinary amounts of danger is too easy in this country? Yeah, I do. Do I think that there's ways that federal and state governments can work together to make sure that we lessen that potential and that probability? Yeah, I think there are. You talk to the police in Boston, we have some of the most restrictive gun violence laws in the country. Most of the guns used in that crime don't come from Massachusetts. Many of them come from Vermont that have a far less restrictive gun restrictions. Many of them come up to the eastern seaboard, Georgia, Texas. So yeah, we're going to have to do an awful lot more on this. I would say to my colleagues on the right that end up saying this is a mental health issue, sort of. There's been some studies out there that will indicate that in certain instances. In Arizona, the incident where our former colleague Gabby Giffords was shot in Aurora, Colorado. In Connecticut, Sandy Hook, there was obviously individuals suffering from mental illness. That has to be addressed. Then why in the midst of a healthcare debate are you cutting the single biggest payer of mental and behavioral health in this country, Medicaid, to the tune of $8 trillion? If this is a mental health issue, then flush out a mental health care system to ensure that everybody gets access to the care that they need. One. And two, this might be a mental health issue, but it is certainly a gun issue. Right? There are people that suffer from mental illness that have, in certain circumstances, committed these crimes. Yes. They've all used a gun. So I think to try to sit there and say, oh, it's one of these things, well, the facts don't tell you that's the sole cause, but they all have the same instrument. So why don't we look at some of these policies, and as you dive into it, they can be a bit difficult. But there's also other ways to go about this. There's ways to say, if you tried to align for a party that's supposed to be about economics and free markets, you might have an individual right to bear arms. It doesn't mean that you have a right to have me subsidize it. When you have a mass shooting in Las Vegas and the enormous cost then for the survivors of that shooting that are paralyzed or have long-term needs for trauma, for mental health counseling, there might be a violent crime fund. That violent crime fund is normally capped at about $25,000 at the state level. You blow through that by the time you hit an emergency room with a gunshot wound. So who pays for it? Government? The rest of us and healthcare premiums? Well, that's somewhat silly. Why is there not an assessment of a fine or additional fee on the sale of either guns or bullets or something else to say, hey, this will go into a fund to make sure that victims get the care that they need, so that the rest of us aren't paying for your exercise of a right, which might be a right, but it doesn't mean you have a right to have me subsidize your right. Why is it that we can't have insurance policy on those guns to say it's not up to the federal government to take your guns away, but just to say, look, if somebody exhibits these different risk factors, they have to pay a higher premium, just like it does if you're driving a car and you get a bunch of speeding tickets. why can't we just say, okay, well, that's fine. And if you find an insurance company that's willing to pay to license you to have that gun, then great. But if that premium ends up being cost prohibitive, that might be because you are so risky that maybe you shouldn't have one. And by the way, you can segment that off of the harm potentially inflicted by a revolver versus an AR-15, which are not the same. So I think there's ways to also kind of to go a little bit on offense here and say, look, what is underlying this? What is, in fact, the issue that you are trying to get at? What is your objection? Because I think we can all say every child deserves to be safe at school. And the answer to that, I'm sorry, I just don't think is having guns manufacturers sell more guns to more teachers. They're right.
I can't wait to see that fight between the NRA and the insurance companies. This will be an extraordinary thing. Thank you. The questions are all good, and I'm going to try to get to them. This one I won't ask because it's basically, all right, why don't you run in 2024? But it does, I'm going to give you, and you can keep this in your pocket, it refers to your youthful good looks and charm. So you can keep that for a bad day. Other things, too.
To my staffer that wrote this, you did just get a raise.
They did a good job. This one, I want to ask for just straight up, will you vote to impeach? And why don't you talk about Mueller and impeachment and what that means? And would it be a good idea or a bad idea, or maybe that's the wrong question? I have a hunch that's what you think, actually. But
yeah, so there's a lot in that very simple question. There's a lot there. So who knows if these reports are accurate that Mr. Mueller is going to be potentially presenting the Justice Department with the final report in the coming days. I assume that he's going to have to wrap up eventually, and now sounds like as good a time as any, so hopefully we're there. I hope that I share this view with everybody here. I genuinely, and I mean this sincerely, hope that Mr. Mueller comes back with a report that says, we indicted 34 people, that's it. Nobody else did anything wrong. There's no evidence whatsoever of collusion between the senior Trump administration officials, senior Trump campaign officials, Trump himself, members of his family, and WikiLeaks or links to Russian intelligence. That did not happen. There's no evidence of it. We've looked everywhere, and end of story, end of case. I hope that's what he says.
It's not going to happen.
I was going to say that.
I hope that's what he says.
Saving me the trouble.
Apparently, that's not likely. And look, I think the answer to that is, with regards to Mr. Mueller, it depends on what those reports say. With regards to a number of the other issues, legal issues that the president is confronted with, some coming out of the U.S. Attorney's offices in New York, Eastern District and Southern District, those cases, I think, have to play out. Many of these issues around the president's finances and his tax returns. Yes, the American public deserves to see those, and I think that process is developing. I think I've got serious concerns with almost everything that this administration has done. Look, you had headlines, I think it was yesterday, EJ, correct me if I'm wrong on this, where you had the Secretary of Commerce, came out the Secretary of Commerce did not sell stocks that he said that he sold. You had the Attorney General describe his job as falling on a grenade for the president. You had the Secretary of Education indicate that they were obstructing an Inspector General's report in the midst of the Department of Education. And you had senior White House officials trying to get around existing federal law to provide nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. That was one day. One day, right? So yeah, I don't agree with what this administration is doing. I do think when it comes to a question of impeachment, this is something that everybody in this country should take very, very seriously. And I want to make sure that the country is ready for it, the facts are on the table, and that this is the high bar, that is, that deliberate standard is met.
What do you say on the flip side? Because there's obviously a strong case you do this with great sort of concern and worry, and you don't want to jump to it. On the other hand, even if it can't pass the Senate, if there are crimes, is the House not living up to its responsibilities if it doesn't impeach, if it chooses for political or other reasons not to impeach?
No, look, I don't think, so impeachment, part of that obviously is a political question, it's a political vote, but there's a legal standard there, and I think that this is one of those circumstances where if there's firm evidence, from my perspective, whether that's beyond a reasonable doubt or clear and convincing that the president has in fact committed these crimes, I assume it's beyond a reasonable doubt for that standard, then I think that's one, the House of Representatives needs to do a full-on investigation of that, which I think, again, that certainly didn't happen under Devin Nunes and a House Intelligence Committee under a Republican administration or Republican leadership. But I think that, look, just because the argument is that there's so much corruption that you don't hold anybody accountable because there's just so much of it, yeah, no, that argument's terrible, right? We have a responsibility to make sure that the American public understand what the actions and inactions of this administration are when it comes to compliance with federal law.
See, I was going to ask you the easiest question of the night, which is there a national emergency at the border?
No.
But an audience member asked it in a more interesting way, so I will just quote this question. What would you say to those across the aisle who side with the president and not the Constitution? And there's a hashtag, of course, fake national emergency. This is a serious issue because this is the president potentially abusing power in a rather extraordinary way to override the wishes of Congress in terms of appropriations. And there are legal arguments that Congress actually ceded a heck of a lot more power to the president than they realized when they passed some of these emergency laws earlier. But what do you make of this? And thank you for the polemical question.
So I think this question puts some Republican colleagues in a very, very difficult spot. So I think the audience probably knows, or most of you all know the issues at our border. One, if the argument is there's too many people coming, well, there's far less people coming than there were 20 years ago. If the argument is there's undocumented immigrants create too much violent crime, well, they actually commit less crime than native-born Americans. Well, if the argument is there's an unaccompanied minor crisis, yeah, you created that crisis and you made it worse. If the argument is, I don't know what else of an argument they can point to, but regardless, there is a humanitarian issue at our border. That issue is being exacerbated by actions and inactions of this administration by the fact that they are not trying to address it. If you really want to address the issues of those arrivals, one, surge administrative judges down there to actually adjudicate those asylum claims more quickly so you can try to determine who actually has a legal claim for asylum and who doesn't. If you really want to solve this problem long term, you're actually going to be addressing, and this is hard, folks, there's no shortcut here, but addressing the reasons why people are fleeing Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, which are different reasons. The Northern Highlands in Guatemala are different reasons that people flee than it is San Pedro Sula and Honduras, which is the murder capital of the Western Hemisphere. So these are really hard structural problems, but we're not coming anywhere close to trying to solve those problems there. We're waiting until it becomes an issue on our border and then saying, hey, what are we going to do about it? Well, engage folks in those three countries and actually try to solve that problem there. And in the meantime, address the issue here by trying to make sure that under existing law, we actually have, and we should be proud of the asylum laws that we have here. We should make sure that people fleeing violence and destitution and sexual trafficking and narco trafficking and all of the other reasons why those folks flee, that have their cases heard. And EJ, there are tough issues on the margins here of, I've been down to the border a couple of times. I walked through Juarez, parts of Juarez with folks from a local organization there that were taking care of some of those unaccompanied minors, and the stories that they heard, a grandmother that, if I try to get this right, a grandmother that left with her granddaughter after her husband was murdered and the parents were taken out, shot, chopped up, and their house was burned down, right? And if you take that family and she went to the police, and it was the police, when she went to the police station, they found the police having a party with the murderers that actually committed the crime. So she left. So could she get a police report saying, hey, this is what happened? Probably not. How do you prove that that actually is what happened? How do you prove that she lived in that place? What if you left in a hurry and you didn't bring the birth certificate? What if you didn't get a birth certificate to begin with? How do you actually prove, what's the standard? How do you actually come up with the corroborating documents or stories to prove that this actually merits an asylum claim? Some of this stuff is legitimately hard. There's hard questions there. I don't want to dismiss that. But under no solution is the answer to that building a wall and separating a kid from their mother. Right? Just like, that's not the answer. So some level of humanity, sobriety, level-headedness, and compassion about saying, hey, we are a sovereign nation. We do regulate who comes into our country. We need to do that. There's a real challenge here. Let's work with other nations in the region. We can work with our partners in Mexico. We can work with, obviously, those 3 countries. We can work with the UN and the International Organization on Migration. We can try to coordinate aid and make sure that folks actually get the assistance that they need. I've been down to those countries too. You visited some of the houses or facilities that house victims of sexual trafficking, 12-year-old girls. I mean, it's heartbreaking and it's terrifying. But you can't sit there and go through that and say, I don't know why they flee.
I want to go back to link this to some of the moral capitalism talk. How can someone like you or a politician with your point of view talk to Trump voters who, on the one hand, completely support what the president's doing at the border? They believe in the wall. On the other hand, believe that the economic system is unfair to them and have a whole argument which you, in the course of these speeches, basically justify and say is entirely justified given what's happened to their lives. How can people keep 2 ideas in their heads at the same time, which is to condemn these aspects of Trumpism that are morally offensive, and on the other hand, keep the lines of communication open to at least some of the folks who are supporting him in the hope of converting them, persuading them?
So, I'm not sure I have a great answer for you on that. If I thought I really knew that answer, maybe I would be running for president. So there's that.
Elizabeth Warren has that answer.
Well, there you go. And 30 other people too, right? So,
I'm just referring to your candidate.
yes. The best answer I can give you, EJ, is probably not wholly satisfying, but I think it's the truthful one, is actually engaging some of those voters in conversation and asking more questions and just saying, okay, you're for a wall. Why? What do you understand that problem to be, and why does a wall fix it? And just explain it to me. And no judgment, no nothing, but just help me understand what it is about this issue that you think a wall is going to solve. And I don't think a wall alone does solve that issue, but actually hear people out on it. And when it comes to the counterpoint around aspects of an economy, I think that's where, and their own economic anxiety and the levels of, on the one hand, disenfranchisement and fear that then comes with it, about a very human response if you do not believe that you can, in fact, provide a better future for folks tomorrow than today, about the fact that those elbows are going to go up and you're going to become protective and you're going to lash out at anybody else. And do your best to understand why it is, one, that people feel that way, and people are going to feel that way because that's their reality. But then try to, best you can, actually understand what contributed to that reality. This is not wholly fair, but I hope you'll roll with me on this. Where I'm from, there's not a whole lot of support for a fossil fuel industry, right? Coal, oil, natural gas. And a big belief that climate change is real and that we need to do more about it and that we're not, which I agree with. There has been a tendency, though, to vilify not just fossil fuels as an industry, but the people that actually work in it or their livelihoods provide it. And I think down in your hometown, we had a big coal-fired power plant in Brayton Point. And I can understand how if you had somebody that went to work in a dangerous job into the belly of a mountain to come out with a black piece of rock that was actually going to literally power power a community, power a hometown, power a nation. And you had folks that, were at the Starbucks across the street from my law school that were working on some paper to try to put that industry out of business while your hunk of coal was frothing the latte. Like, they might take a bit of an exception to that. And at the same time, in Massachusetts, we have a reverence for a fishing industry that is deeply connected with our history, with our culture. It is called Cape Cod for a reason. But there's a tension there between the science around fishing and catches and quotas and climate change and different currents and weather patterns and what that means, and an industry that has literally been part of the fabric of our country and our community from its very founding days. And we recognize, I think, back home in Massachusetts, that tension with fishermen and the science, yet also wanting to eat fish and wanting to have a healthy diet and all the rest of it, but saying there's a balance here we have to strike. But sometimes don't share that same amount of empathy for a guy that went into the belly of a mountain to try to provide not just energy to power a nation, but a livelihood to power his family. And I think there is a way to show some respect and gratitude and empathy for the challenge that the contribution that those areas, those communities, those families have made for our country because they helped build it, while also recognizing that our understanding of the consequences of some of our actions have become more robust and have changed, and that we have to change too, but that we can do that in lockstep, not by finger pointing or saying, hey, you know what the solution to that is for you folks in Charleston, West Virginia, or Harlingen, or anywhere else. It's to go take some federal government money, pick up, move 250 miles and become a nurse if you're 45 years old. Yeah, well, you can tell me that there's economic data that tells me I should do that, but I actually don't want to be a nurse. And I don't want to move 250 miles. This is where I grew up. It's where my grandfather grew up. It's where my great-grandfather grew up. This is home. Well, they should be able to have, we should be able to have a government that engages in that discussion and say, okay, let's find a way to try to make this work. And let's find a way to respect your choices and your history and your community and your culture and your tradition as we do so, while we also understand that climate change is in fact real and we're going to have to make some change. Otherwise, we're all screwed.
The organizers of this know what they're doing, and they wanted us to end in an hour. However, I wanted to, with the blessing of the organizers, I want to do two things. One is I want to just read off several questions because I want the audience to know we heard them. One I couldn't resist throwing at you, and you can pick whichever one of these you want to answer, or you can combine them into, I'll just hand them to you.
Okay.
This one I couldn't resist asking. What do you think of Howard Schultz running for president as an independent? Second, what led to your decision to endorse this early in the race? My answer is he is from Massachusetts, by the way. Why, Senator Warren? With no disrespect to her, who also taught you in law school. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember right.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think of Bernie? And by when does he need to drop out so as not to hurt Democrats' chances? And then two more, and you could take it where you want. What's the difference between a pragmatic Democrat and a progressive Democrat? There are progressive pragmatists. That's my footnote. And what role, and this one you knew I wanted to ask anyway, what role has religion played in your life? So you can take from Howard Schultz to God.
Yeah.
I assume he sees the difference.
So, look, one of the beautiful things about our system is anybody can run. I think you probably know the numbers more than I do. I think there's actually like 400 candidates that have actually already decided that they're running for president. You probably haven't heard of most of them. I don't know how, I haven't heard of most of them, but anybody that wants to run, come on in and run. I do think, though, that if you're going to run, you have to be willing to have ideas flushed out as to how you are going to address the concerns that our country is putting forth and are able to articulate them, address them, and build a coalition that can actually show that you can win. And I would encourage anybody that wants to do that, anybody else in the crowd that wants to announce tonight, there's a great stage up here. You got a great audience up there. But you know, this shouldn't just be an exercise for anybody. You shouldn't go at this lightly. Not to say Mr. Schultz is, but the consequences of this election are going to be extraordinarily serious with regards to domestic policy, with regards to foreign policy, with regards to the United States' role in international alliances, NATO, involvement in partnerships in Africa, in Asia, China, Russia, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. Understand the consequences of what that participation is, but I'm not going to be somebody that discourages anybody from, if you have ideas and a platform, from going out there and trying to sell it. Senator Warren. Senator Warren, I have known for years. She was, in fact, my law school professor. I met my wife in her class. There's a funny story about that. That is deeply humiliating to me. So time's running short, unfortunately. She called on me first class, first day, first question. The lasting contribution I will always make to society is that if you Google the word assumpsit, my picture comes up. That was not by design, but it is unfortunately the contribution I will make to American society with the Google search. I didn't know the answer, and it got really ugly really fast. Why her? One, I've known her for an awfully long time. I think she is an extraordinary intellect. She's our senior senator. She's a voice of a progressive movement. I think she's a wonderful human being and a great person. I also think that, as I tried to articulate earlier, the single biggest issue that I think confronts America today is this issue around the structural inequities and inefficiencies in our economy and the way that it leaves far too many of us behind. There is no candidate out there, announced or potentially going to announce, that is dedicated to more time, effort, energy, or understands those issues better than Senator Warren. So that's why her. What do I think of Bernie Sanders' candidacy, and when does he need to drop out? So I'm going to go back to a bit of what I said on Howard Schultz. Look, I don't think any surprise to anybody in this audience, and certainly not a surprise to Senator Sanders. I didn't support him in the last election. I will not be supporting him in this one. Let's hold on now. He also raised $6 million in a day by small dollar contributions, right? Folks, this is something where even if you don't like the policies that a Democratic candidate is putting forth, we got to have the confidence in our candidates to go there and show something better, and show something that is actually going to be a more appropriate steward of the hopes, fears, aspirations, and concerns of the American public. And Bernie has every right to do that, just like anybody else does. Anybody else on that list of folks that has announced or might announce. And when should he drop out? When his support wanes and when it's clear he's not going to win, which I don't know when that will be. I don't know if that will be. But if anybody out there thinks that, given what we just went through in 2016, that what the Democratic Party, what our country needs, is some perception of fingers on the scale to hand the nomination or anybody else to somebody else that has not earned it. Man, one of the biggest challenges our candidates face across the country is credibility and the strength that you get from winning a nomination, winning it, not having somebody else hand it to you, not having somebody else lose it, but by a candidate winning it. We need a strong candidate going in to face off against President Trump. I think Senator Sanders has the infrastructure and the ideas behind that infrastructure to go an awfully long way. I think his ideas are powering a lot of the discussion, obviously, that is guiding part of this debate that we're in now, like it or not. But if you don't, we better find, our country had better find somebody else that has answers for that, because he is pretty authentic about and genuine about the direction that he believes the country needs to go in. And even though I don't agree with all of it, I think you got to admire somebody that's willing to step up, stand out, and do that and run that way. What's the difference between a pragmatic Democrat and a progressive Democrat? So look, I think I'm going to interpret progressive as being idealistic, and I think the difference is, I would like to think you can be both, but the difference is having an understanding of where it is that as a country we need to aspire to go, or we should aspire to go, and the pragmatism of recognizing that if you are going to wait to get the whole enchilada for all of these challenges at one time, you're going to be waiting an awfully long time, and there are too many people in too dire a need to wait that long. And so that doesn't mean you sell out, that doesn't mean you don't fight, but that does mean that when we have an opportunity to actually make sizable changes to adjust or to address some of these concerns and actually affect the impact of, or affect millions of people's lives and the challenge that they face in order to provide a better future for their kids, we take it. And you turn around to fight another day. I am biased in this, I'm not gonna pretend not to be. My uncle's, Ted Kennedy, I think was a pretty good senator. He was a, thank you. He introduced a single-payer bill in 1971. He fought for health care almost his entire tenure in the Senate, inspired by what he saw his son go through when his son had childhood pediatric cancer and lost a leg to it. And the struggles that he went through and the anxiety that he felt, that they felt as a family, even with enormous means at that time, and wondered how it would be that any other family could get through it. And the stories that he told that I remember hearing of him literally walking the halls of folks and talking to other families in a pediatric cancer ward, wondering how it is that they actually made this work, how that is that they got through it. His son, my cousin Patrick, left a note the day that the Affordable Care Act was passed. Took a piece from the Senate floor that day, and wrote a note on his grave and said, "Dad, your work's finally done." And yes, on the one hand, a big piece of it was. On the other hand, I think he'd be the first to say we got an awful lot more work to do. But if it took him 50 years plus of working day in and day out with Democrats and Republicans and filing a single-payer bill back in 1970s, and then moving to a public option and just expanding, creating CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and moving to try to expand and flush out all sorts of different other programs to expand healthcare, you don't just sit there and wait, because the need is too great and there's too many folks that are hurting and need assistance. And so you keep moving and you keep fighting and you keep swinging. And welcome to democracy. What role has religion played in my life, and what are my views?
And then I think then the organizers will
gonna kick us
off
out.
the stage.
Great.
But it's good to end on God.
Thanks, EJ. So look, I grew up Catholic. My religious background gets a little complicated. My full disclosure, my parents went through a divorce, and the church ended up being at the center of that. So I had a bit of a complex relationship with the church, and I still, to an extent, do. I'm a pretty progressive Democrat, and there's a lot of things that, a lot of differences I have with current Catholic Church doctrine, without going down that rabbit hole at the moment. But particularly salient at this moment, given some of the challenges before the church. However, the core aspect of the religion that was passed on to me by my family ends up being very much, EJ, in that kind of Catholic social doctrine of the Jesuits, and informed by the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount about not just a golden rule of doing unto others, but by making sure that for those that are not fully included in society, those that are on the outskirts, that are on the margins, that if you believe that every human is created in God's image, that every single one of those folks counts too. And that promise that actually the religious views that helped inform our founding documents, to ensure that all men are created equal, and knowing that when we said men, we meant rich, white, Protestant men. But knowing that the two phrases that speak to me most in our founding documents, EJ, are the pursuit of happiness and that more perfect union. Because both of those codify to me the idea that this idea of America is not actually ever necessarily going to be fully attained, but it is in the pursuit, it is in the struggle, it is in the fight, it is in that quest to make it more perfect, it is in that pursuit of happiness, of fulfillment, of addressing that anxiety, whatever that may be, of making sure that government was actually founded to enable individuals, families to pursue happiness. Doesn't mean you're going to get there, but to be able to rest your head at night with some level of confidence and optimism about what tomorrow will be, not fear and anxiety about what you were not able to accomplish today. And I think that at its core, whether it's a Jewish religion, a Catholic one, Christian writ large, those values actually hold about all of us at some point being a stranger in a strange land and needing to be welcomed and needing to be comforted, and knowing that there is far more that connects us as a community than that divide us. I'll end on this one. I've had the extraordinary fortune of traveling to a lot of countries around the world. I imagine many of you in this audience have as well. I challenge you to think of a country that you have ever visited, however poor that is, that if you ever found a group of kids, if you threw a ball at them, they did not throw it back. Right? Whether it's been in some of the poorest slums of India or Africa or Dominican Republic or Latin America, kids smile, kids are kids, kids want to play. And kids don't care about anything else, really, as to whether you will play with them back. And if they are made in God's image too, then it's worth fighting for a country and a world that recognizes their talent and their potential and that wants them to play. So. Good shot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go. Thank you. Done?